So before I start, I actually have a special prize to hand out. Somebody found a mobile phone. So if you recognize this phone in the picture, please come and pick it up somewhere.
If nobody wants, I'm interested.
Sorry, the what ID? The medical ID. Yeah, exactly. We found the owner. All right. So good to be here. Okay, there we go. We have a winner. It's just like a show. He comes down the stairs and we have a winner. Give him an applause, guys. Yes, very good. So, hi, my name is Otto. And when Chris Freck actually reached out to me probably 1.5 months ago to have a chat here at this event, for me it was really a trip down memory lane, and I started digging in my archives and found this screenshot out of 2005, I think, when we first figured that developers were actually an important audience and we probably better do something for them, and that's where we started thinking about Tridion Dev World at the time, which evolved in SDL Tridion World and is now the community. So that kind of gives away a little bit about my background. So I'm actually used to be a professional musician, trained at the conservatory, and then I went off and studied languages and cultures of Latin America and wrote my thesis about the Cuban rumba. Not the Cuban rum, which is a very good alternative, but Cuban rumba. And both of those things make me very qualified to be standing here and talking about technology. Thank you. And so, like many other people that sort of were looking for a job, late 90s, I ended up in IT at a bunch of companies, but by far the company that I've worked the most years for has been first Tridion and then SDL from 2000 to 2014. So I've been in software for a while, worked at some other companies as well, Atom Software and some more, and these days I'm actually helping a lot of different software companies. You can see some of the logos over here, sort of getting to their next phases of growth and kind of learning from all the mistakes that I've made in my career. So that's kind of what I do. And what I want to be doing today is probably the least technology-oriented chat of this whole event. I'm going to be talking a little bit about or taking you through a journey about science, both in terms of how science evolved through time, as well as how we can learn from the different disciplines of science, and actually how those things compare to where we are technologists in digital experience. And so I'm actually going to start with physical science and a little bit of history around that. So this gentleman is called Christian Huygens, and he lived in the 17th century, and he was actually an astronomer, a mathematician, a physicist, and an inventor, all at the same time. And he probably was making a living somewhere as well. And if that sounds like a little bit too much and incredulous, he actually did some really, really big things for science. So some of his discoveries in astronomy were the discovery of the rings around Saturnus, and he actually also discovered one of Saturnus's moons. And the reason he was able to do that, he was also the inventor of what they call the Huygens eyepiece, in which he discovered that if you actually put two lenses with some distance between them, it actually eliminates a lot of the blurriness and the chromatic aberrations that you would get in lenses before that time. And why did he invent that? Because he wanted to actually discover things in astronomy. So that's where physics and astronomy started to overlap. And on top of that, he actually invented the pendulum clock, your grandmother's clock. And he did his research based on some work by Galileo, but he was actually the inventor of the first pendulum clock. And that was important because if you do astronomy, you actually need to know the timing of things circumventing the Earth and understanding how all those things fit together. And the pendulum clock actually was in use from the time that he invented it up to the 1930s as the most accurate timing instrument that we had, until kind of electric clock and atomic clocks superseded that. So those are quite some achievements for one single guy. And I think it's representative of the time of that the state of science in that particular period. So basically, one person could achieve a lot in a lot of different areas. And so over the period of time, and I kind of think this correlates with the Industrial Revolution, we saw more and more specialization in science. So different fields like chemistry and mathematics and physics all emerged as mature areas of them by their own right. And people were completely specializing in one of those fields. And there was actually a lot of ground to cover there. So we had so much to discover that you could happily make breakthrough discoveries and inventions in each of those individual areas. And we saw that specialization both in the scientists as well as in the engineers that made all these kind of apparatuses for the scientists to actually make those advancements. So this lasted for quite a while, and I think where we're now is science in the information revolution. And I've taken the CERN Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, right on the border between France and Switzerland, as a good example of that. So the Large Hadron Collider is actually made to prove a theory about the Higgs boson. No idea what it actually is, but it's quite important for fundamental science. It is the largest single machine in the world, and it was built by over 10,000 scientists. I didn't even know this, but actually they run the largest cluster of computers to actually analyze all the data that's coming out of this. And the point about it is no longer can you actually create enough advance in each of the fields without collaborating with so many different disciplines. You can imagine that in those 10,000 scientists, there were chemists, there were physicists, there were mathematicians, there were construction engineers, there were computer engineers, and only by working together could they create those kind of advances like discovering or proving that something like the Higgs boson actually existed. So, if we take that kind of history and apply it to digital experience, I think you can actually talk about a similar line of development. So I went way back and looked at the renaissance or the naissance, better said, of the web or the internet. And that was the time when we were still happily coding away in tools like front page, and many other HTML editors. There were basically no proven business models, so people were putting stuff online just because it was cool and it was dandy. And I remember those days when we started with Tridion, we were literally replacing home-built systems, either kind of database-driven systems that with an HTML front end or HTML pages, and they were running on a server down the desk of the marketing director. So that's very comparable to Christian Huygens. You do everything yourself. Marketers were coding and they were kind of inventing that, and sort of the very early days of CMS technology. It lasted fairly short because we evolved very quickly, and kind of our industrial revolution, I think probably was around 2004 to 2010 or something like it, where basically within each of the online disciplines we were putting a lot of energy in creating better tools. So this was Site Edit at the time, again a very, very old screenshot. But basically the efforts we put into were improving things like workflows or editors or publishing management. There was a lot of features, a lot of ground to cover for a CMS. And really, if you looked at how customers used us, they were just happy running their website and perfecting their website. There was no need, for example, for any integrations between different tools. So where we are today, digital experience, and I don't care whether you call it digital experience platforms or customer experience platform. This image I took from Digital Clarity Group. You can get that white paper from the SDL website, and it just shows the size of the bigger ecosystem that we call digital experience these days. So I'm not going to go through each of the bubbles, but basically if you compare that to the Large Hadron Collider, if you want to be successful online, there's not just a single tool that you can be using. It's not just the WCMS, it's not just the documentation, it's not just the e-commerce or the customer data. It needs to be across the board and everything needs to be integrated. And we need to have that collaboration between all of those different disciplines in order to make sense out of this from a customer perspective. If we want to serve our customers well, we actually need to collaborate across all of those disciplines and all of those tools, which also means we need to exchange data and content across all of those tools. You'll see plenty of talks about integration and data and content exchange during this talk, but I think it really and truly puts us in a similar space as the Large Hadron Collider. And just to prove scientifically how true that is, they actually look remarkably similar. So that leads us to my first scientific conclusion: digital experience platforms equal the Large Hadron Collider. So that brings us to the next area of science, which is natural sciences. And you probably know this gentleman, Charles Darwin, who came up with the theory of the evolution of species, or the origin of species, as he called his book. And it fundamentally changed the way that we thought about everything around us in nature and how it evolved, and sort of literally even religion, and how powerful God was versus how powerful nature was. And you may not know this gentleman, Dave Resnick, and he is actually a professor of biology, and he has written some interpretative work about, you know, if we look at Darwin's research by today's standards and all the kind of fights he had to make against religion and so forth, how should we look at Darwin's work today? But he also did some studies on evolution himself. And you can actually see in a very blurry way some of his subjects in front of him. He actually researched guppies, very, very small fish, and he researched them in Trinidad, Tobago. And the research that he did is he took guppies from different parts of a single river, or in some cases of a river system, and he transplanted a small community of guppies from downstream before waterfalls to upstream. And he started looking at really kind of what starts happening with those guppies. And what he found is actually within 11 years and probably 30 to 60 generations of guppies, there are very notable differences between the different locations that those guppies lived in. So you really could see that within a very short time frame, the environment had a profound effect on how those guppies evolved. You can see the one at the top where there was low predation, they were able to grow bigger, they changed their size, less streamlined because they didn't have to flee from all these competitors, and the ones at the bottom which were just smaller. And there's many other differences. There's cool websites around the Guppy project or the Guppy evolution online, very fun stuff to read. But basically it showed us that the evolution can actually go a lot quicker than Darwin anticipated. Darwin just started with looking at bones and different species in different locations and see the differences between them, and he never was able to actually witness the evolution of species. So again, if we take those learnings, the speed of evolution is a lot bigger than we think. If we take that learning to digital experience, you've already seen this chart on the screen this morning. This is the Chief Martech overview of the digital experience space through time. And he actually started doing it in 2011. I think at the time it was for him just a fun kind of project. Today he has a team of scientists to actually fit all the logos on one screen. You need to do it with sort of algorithms because otherwise they won't fit on anymore. But you can see that he started with just 150 different vendors that he was tracking over to almost 7,000 where we are today. So that's a phenomenal evolution of our space, basically. It just shows that there's a huge amount of money, and again, he has a website that you can read a lot of stuff about, and how much money from venture capital is going in there, and how many companies are working together and doing stuff, but it just shows the evolution of digital experience is going at breakneck speed. And so one of the things that I looked at for this chat was actually, it is not just the size or the speed at which we're growing this community, it's also constantly evolving. So if you look at the evolution of the different categories in those big NASCAR slides of all those logos, if you compare the 2011 one to the 2018, left hand, right hand, there's only 4 categories in digital experience that are still the same as they were 7 years ago. And those are CRM, email marketing, mobile apps, and mobile marketing. All the other categories have changed. They have either merged and morphed into something different but similar, but 27 new categories have evolved from this, and 16 categories are no longer relevant for our space. And so the point about it is we're in a world where that evolution is going like crazy, and what we're doing today may not make any sense anymore tomorrow. So it makes life extremely complex. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the examples or the things that cause that rapid speed of evolution, Hummingbird. How many of you know the Hummingbird release of Google search algorithm? Okay, a couple of you. That's a very low number. I'll explain to you why it's relevant. Hummingbird has their, Google has their search algorithm, obviously, and they change it every now and then to just increase the relevancy of their search results. The Hummingbird release and the RankBrain releases were 2 releases that were affecting quite a bit about how Google shows results. Previously, they basically, as a marketer, if you included the right kind of keywords in your pages, you would end up pretty high in the search engine results pages. So it was really, the game was trying to cram in as many keywords as you could in a relevant way still, but there was this kind of whole industry around keyword research and how to put it in without kind of making your readers crazy, and you know, you got all the kind of spam things where people put as many kind of keywords in their HTML headers without ever being relevant, a whole game around it, and Hummingbird and RankBrain changed that. Because what they said is actually, we're going to look at the bigger context of the content that you're writing. So rather than focusing on individual keywords, we're going to be analyzing the text of that page. We're going to be looking at how frequently you use similar terms or related terms, and we're going to be looking at how you actually are not just writing one page about that topic, but actually a bunch of pages about that topic that are related to each other. And basically that means if you are writing more about a topic, you're going to be more relevant, you are apparently an expert, and we're going to rank you higher. And so as a marketer, what that means is, rather than inserting keywords and investigating keywords into your pages, you actually need to be creating what they call topic clusters and pillar pages. So pillar pages are long form pieces of content, which is, even from a marketing perspective, now relevant. It's no longer that your page needs to be short. So it needs to be long, it needs to be relevant and filled with information, and it needs to have a lot of links to other pages about this topic. And from a technology perspective, doing this as a practitioner sucks. All the tools that are available out there to actually manage your search engine optimization are completely built around keyword optimization. They're not built around things like topic clusters, so they don't actually understand your content. They cannot help you creating links between content pieces, and so that's actually where it becomes relevant for this audience. You actually need to build links between pages, and those links need to be bi-directional. You need to figure out which content is actually relevant in my CMS, because you probably have tons of blog posts. So a lot of the semantic stuff that we were talking about within the context of Tridion Docs is as relevant for search engine optimization and marketing as well. Another example of how the rapid evolution of ecosystem forces companies to change. You probably saw it in the news, I think it was the day before yesterday, where Amazon reached the $1 trillion US market cap value, which is humongous. I mean, it's ridiculous. So they're an incredibly powerful and valuable and wealthy company. Yet if you look at their market share in the Chinese market, they only have 1.3 market share. And why? Partially regulation, because there's a lot of barriers to entry in the Chinese market, but also because there's companies like Alibaba that have been around there for ages. And this is a screenshot. It's actually a real screenshot. It's not a mashup or anything, from Tmall. And Tmall is like the big eBay or Amazon within China. And as you can see from the screenshot, Amazon chose to, rather than try and create its own beachhead within China, they chose to actually go live on Tmall. So you now have a specific Amazon section within Tmall, and they felt that that was the only way they were going to be successful. And now again, this is ramifications for the technology. Rather than being able to drive your own website, it meant that they needed to push all of their content, which they already had completely optimized, just using their own algorithms and their own optimizations. They now need to push that stuff over out to Tmall, which is incredibly complex, both from a marketing perspective as well as from a technology perspective. So just two examples to show how the evolution of digital experience is just going very, very quickly. Which leads me to my second scientific conclusion. Digital experience equals guppies, and by a mathematical equation we can now, so if we know that DXP is the Hadron Collider and DXP equals guppies, we now know that the Large Hadron Collider is actually guppies, and also that a 10,000 scientists equal 11 years of evolution. I never figured that I would find that out preparing this talk, but there you go. The point about it is that we are living in this digital experience ecosystem. It's large, it's wild, there's a lot of attacks coming from different sides, and we need to survive in that ecosystem. And that ecosystem has value both from a business perspective, where we need to invent new business models like Amazon going into China and figuring out how they sell that, and from a technology perspective, where we're constantly inventing new technologies that can be used to actually survive in the ecosystem. And that's where things like data exchange and content exchange and connectivity all come into play. And so to just give you some more examples of companies I've worked with, Colgate-Palmolive was actually an Atom software customer. Atom does a digital asset management system, and Colgate-Palmolive used them to manage all of their product information. So they have a range of products with a surprising amount of variations in those products. But the more kind of mind-blowing fact when we went out to talk to them, each of their products, like this toothpaste, for each of those products they manage over 900 product attributes. And those product attributes include things like the ingredients which come out of their ERP systems, but they also include different variations of images that are going to be showing on eBay versus Amazon versus Walmart websites. They're including different kind of taxonomies that each of those vendors are using to find and classify people. It includes metadata in all its kind of different variations. And you can imagine it's a nightmare to manage 900 product attributes for one single product. There's not a single person that can actually understand what that does. But in order to survive in their ecosystem, which basically means they're selling through a hell of a lot different retail channels and e-commerce channels, they need to provide that kind of richness of content. So that's about an external ecosystem, an internal ecosystem. And actually, we already talked about this to some extent, but this was, so you know, HP.com has been a Tridion customer for quite a while. I think it was around 2011 when their head of global support came visiting us. And so we chatted about, you know, why is this relevant for you, and yada, 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 a lot of talk. And then at a certain moment in time he mentioned that 70% of all traffic to HP.com actually goes to the support side rather than the marketing-led website. And we were kind of so proud that we're doing hp.com and all the traffic and it's a big website, and actually, well, no, it doesn't really matter. 70% of people just goes in, find a new driver for their new operating system, find where they can find replacement parts for it, or a new inkjet cartridges, and so forth. So really the king of hp.com is not marketing, it's support. However, he had no way of linking marketing content into his support presence. So he was saying, you know, if people are looking for a new driver for an old printer, I can actually easily push them a recommendation about buying a newer printer and providing an offer. Really easy, but I can't do it. There's no ways from a technology perspective that I can do it. But also, he didn't get the attention from marketing. Marketing really wasn't interested in talking to support. And so, because they thought they were king of hp.com. And so, really hard to make that thing work together. And by the way, this goes both ways. It's not just marketing who doesn't want to talk to support. The other way around as well. And I remember being at one of the Tridion, what's now Tridion Docs events, and we were talking about things like search engine optimization, and we literally had one of the documentation writers ask, oh, but does that mean that you actually think I should publish all of my PDFs online? And we were kind of like, well, yeah, duh. But like, this was 5 years ago, and they have never thought about, you know, that may actually be relevant and that content may be good for us. So, a very fastly changing ecosystem. This quote, which is often wrongly attributed to Charles Darwin, it's not his, actually talks about, you know, it's not about the fittest or the most intelligent, it's about the most adaptable that will eventually survive in the ecosystem. And so what does adaptable mean? Swiss Army knife, definitely very adaptable, and a great tool. And if you look at mid-market, this is definitely where you see some companies like HubSpot playing a fantastic role. And I, as a marketer, practitioner, I love HubSpot because basically what it combines is CRM, support, sales, marketing, automation, everything into one single package, which makes life extremely easy for me. So I don't need to worry about my webpage analytics. I can go in there and see it directly there. I don't need to log into Google Analytics or even multiple tools that I use to analyze my webpage traffic. I can do it all in one place, and if leads come in, I can actually easily transfer them to sales or nurture them for that matter. So no integration needed with Marketo. So ideally, you'd have that sort of Swiss Army knife and do everything with that one. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way in digital experience. And so digital experience, in terms of surviving in the ecosystem, more resembles this. You can actually buy this, $950 online, the Bear Grylls Survival Pack. It includes, I think, at least 4 things that look like Swiss Army knives. And a bunch of knives that I wouldn't even know what the difference is and what you would do with them, and you probably need to watch Discovery Channel for ages in order to understand kind of how to use this stuff. This is what the digital experience ecosystem looks like. I can tell you, if you give this to me, I will not survive. I will fail miserably. So that's kind of where we are at, and so if you look at what that means for a marketer, and I couldn't find a better picture than this one, but pretty much the life of a marketer looks like this. It's sort of tabbing between kind of all these different applications that you're using and trying to gobble together all the data and make sense out of it, and actually, you know, the statistics from Google Analytics say something different than what I'm seeing in my CMS, and I really don't understand what's happening now. It is a nightmare. Which, kind of returning to guppies, brings us to the point in Finding Nemo. Now what are we going to do? And so I think we can take another lesson, which is not from science, but from an adjacent category. Enterprise content management, which is kind of content management for the back office, handling claims and storing and archiving and all that kind of stuff. And enterprise content management has been around for quite a while. I remember around 2002, they were really, really hot, and there was this huge consolidation wave, and everybody was saying WCM is dead, and everything is going to be sort of, there's one single tool, just dump your content in there, and everything is going to be hunky-dory. And of course we know now that most ECM implementations have failed over time, just because they were too big and they were trying to be that one single Swiss Army knife that solved everything for you, from building a house to cooking your smoked salmon. Now, and I think that's just fairly recent, last year Gartner actually said ECM's dead, long live content services. I'll get to that in a second. So we know that building that one Swiss Army knife makes no sense, but the question is, what do we need to do instead? And I'm taking again a little bit of a sidestep there. You probably know about the tiny houses movement. Where we are looking at the scarcity of our resources and how we want to spend them, and more people are choosing to actually live in smaller homes rather than big homes. And what they do in order to make that work is make their architecture adaptable. As you can see literally in this screenshot, movable walls, things that you can sort of slide out or use in different ways. That's a physical adaptable architecture, but I think the same goes true for our digital experience ecosystem. And I'm not an architect, so I don't claim that I can present you with what that adaptable architecture looks like. I just know you need something like this in order to make all of this stuff work. The evolution is going too quickly. You simply cannot cope with even a monolithic architecture. Even your architecture itself needs to be able to change and evolve over time. So I'm just stealing this a little bit from Gartner again. With no claim this is going to be applicable to the digital experience system. This was an image made for enterprise content management, but I think kind of conceptually it still makes sense even for digital experience. And kind of what they said for ECM is, we differentiate between things that we call foundational services or platforms, basically repositories where it's either data or content being stored, and some very fundamental services. We have all these kind of components that we can be using, and then there's apps on top of that our end users can be using. And in between all of those, we need to create all of these kind of API layers and connectors. Again, we're going to be talking about that to a large extent in these sessions. So just to bring that kind of same concept, and again, no claim to being exhaustive or perfect, but you could have things like Teradata or Hadoop database for customer data, SDL or Salesforce for some of the foundational elements of it. Components, there's an increasing amount of components available in the market, and actually if you look at that bigger digital experience ecosystem, probably a lot of those are or should actually be just components. So these range from kind of very technology oriented components. So if you look at things like cognitive services in Azure from Microsoft, and Amazon has similar things where they can do things like image recognition, text mining and so forth. Fantastic stuff to be using. We did actually some mashups with them, and you can get to results very, very quickly. But there's also kind of more functional components like iSCAT, who do a lot of the work of pushing out that product content, like I showed you for Colgate-Palmolive. They actually have a big catalog of product content across the world and across a lot of manufacturers, which helps retailers to actually mine that data and use it on their different retail sites. Just a component. Search engine optimization. And a tool like Gather Content, which is really about just content creation, not about content management, just about how you create content. So all the kind of tools. And then similarly on the integration layer, there's kind of generic technology things like Apache Kafka, where you can do real-time messaging as a kind of enterprise service bus. There's generic API management vendors like Apigee and MuleSoft. And then there's like things like Cilio, which are kind of that same thing, but then very specifically for content exchange. And so my guess about this is if you build that adaptable architecture, you're going to have to use a lot of these components for different purposes. And interestingly enough, if you look at things like connectivity, Apigee, MuleSoft, they all try to be the Swiss Army knife for integrations. So they will have content integrations, they will have data integrations and so forth. And we looked at them and we concluded that, you know, they will only work halfway for each of those areas, or they will work well for one and they will not work for a lot of other ones. So my prediction is you're going to have to be using multiple of these kind of frameworks in order to build that adaptable architecture. And the big void, in my view, is actually in digital experience, the applications. Like I said, for marketers, being a marketer kind of sucks at the moment because there's so much possible and it's so incredibly hard to get to the right data and to actually do all of this stuff. So I think there is a big call to action to each of you here, because a lot of that stuff can be made and is actually in some cases relatively easy to build. Always easy, but doable at least, to build better user experiences that combine many of these functionalities. And I think there's a big opportunity there for you to deliver on that promise from a marketer's perspective, because marketers really are, and I don't know whether you've seen the movie Modern Times, where Charlie Chaplin is behind the sort of the, how do you call that? The lopende band? How's it called? Sorry? Yeah, behind the conveyor belt, and is going completely crazy with all the repetitive tasks he has to do. That's the life of a marketer these days. It's just trying to figure out all of that stuff, and you know, how does everything match up, and where do I do what, and so forth. Big opportunity there from my perspective. So we make a last step towards social sciences. This gentleman is called Geert Hofstede. He is a Dutch psychologist, used to work at IBM, and he looked at organizational culture and how organizations work together from kind of almost more an anthropological perspective. And so the thing he is known for is the 6 dimensions of culture. So how do different countries, in this particular case, compare ranked across a set of different characteristics? And the characteristics are, you can read them here, are you individualistic or are you collectivist as a culture? Do you have a large power distance or a short power distance, or is it a masculine society or a feminine society, long-term oriented, short-term oriented? And basically each of these properties, and he's done a lot of research about it, he's mapped onto a world map. And I think, I'm guessing there's at least 25 different nationalities in this single room. Very insightful in terms of how you can actually work together with each other. On the website, he has there is a comparison tool, so you can just select different countries and see how they compare to each other, which is kind of interesting. You can even the point he makes is culture is the software of our minds. Unless we start using the same software or have some kind of enterprise service bus to actually communicate across common terms, we're not going to be successful. And it's really interesting. This is actually my cultural graph. You can go to the website, and for $50 you can actually get your own report. I was delighted to see how masculine I am. It was a big relief, I can tell. But to give you an idea about how this can be helpful, I chose Belgium here as an example. Why? Because I worked in Belgium 2.5 years, and that was a 1.5 hour drive from my home. We speak the same language, and still it was really hard to be successful working with my team over there. And so one of the things that I found out was Belgians as a culture have a large desire to avoid uncertainty. And here I am as a Dutch guy, and we know which direction to go, let's go. We'll figure out things as we go along, and all the details can come later. And sort of my team was really hesitant in sort of doing things because they want to have more certainty before they start walking. So these are kind of interesting pointers in terms of how we need to behave as people in order to make all of this complexity. If you think back again about that Large Hadron Collider and the 10,000 scientists work together, there's actually a lot about this which is non-technical, which is really how do we actually work together as people. And so this kind of brings us to the completely non-scientific, made-up bullshit part of this presentation. But I kind of thought, what if we can think about this developers versus marketers, or developers versus business users. And like said, this is at best based on a hunch. But if we go through it, marketers are much more sort of authoritarian. The CMO is a big guy, whereas developers are like, whatever, I'll do my thing. I think you will recognize that developers are probably more individualistic. And masculinity, I won't comment, but I know there's a lot more women in marketing than men, so that probably accounts for that part. Long-term orientation, I would guess that developers are much more long-term oriented. Marketers are looking at their campaign and they're going to be out into a different job within a year. And intelligence, I just think developers eat more pizzas and drink more Coca-Cola. So anyhow, that's my scientific explanation. The point about it, though, is marketers are from Venus and developers are from Mars. And this is relevant because I think you as developers are the only ones who have at least a chance to understand what's going on in the DX bigger space, and not just in the DX space, but in the generic technology space, and how all of these technologies could actually be used for different applications in a marketing or customer experience or digital experience domain. So I think there is an onus there on you to actually try and understand more what marketers are doing. That's why I asked how many of you actually knew about the Hummingbird algorithms from Google. And if you're a marketer and you're creating marketers tool, it's kind of helpful to know those kind of things. Because it basically means you can relatively easily build new tools and better tools for marketers. So kind of going back to Christian Huygens, there's actually a term for this. It's called Renaissance man or polymath, which basically means it's somebody that is interested in more than one area and can combine those different areas together. And so my call to action again is, I think there's a lot of merit in specialization, and particularly I think in the society we live on, specialists are more valued and probably higher paid in many cases than generalists. And I think generalist has become almost kind of a negative word in a certain way. But if you look at people like Christian Huygens, and if you look at the Large Hadron Collider and how we need to make all of this work together, I would have a call to action to actually become a little bit more of a polymath and sort of reap the opportunities for that. And just as a last point of proof around that, this is some research that Digital Clarity Group did from that same report that I showed the Graaf about earlier, about the digital experience architecture. And they actually saw that digital experience technology decisions are driven to a large extent by either the C-suite, who I think in most cases know very little about technology, or interestingly enough by IT. And again, that's where you come in to play a role and guide them and educate them on making the right choices and developing that architecture so that we actually achieve all of those flexibility goals. So, in summary, I think the things that we hopefully learned from this is we do need to create that adaptable architecture. There's a lot of components out there, but creating those mashups, and luckily I was very happy to see some of the presentations this morning are very much on par with this. So how we create that architecture and how do we integrate all of those things. Definitely fill the void for marketers or digital experience people, make it easier. We've been focusing a long time on things for consumers. I think it's about time to return to the end users. The end users have a fairly big role ahead, and probably organizations should be investing a little bit more in their end users versus just their customers. And lastly, take that role of educating and guiding the C-suite and marketing. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.